second thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we see it.
Giselle and Brent, I'm just looking at the webinar chat. I can see there's the all panelists. Let me see if that's working. All panelists versus all attendees. Did that come through to you?
I'm looking at the chat messages, yes.
Yes, I can also see it.
Cool. Okay, good to know. Thanks.
It's now officially one pass. Good morning, all. My name is Brent Williamson, the policy analyst from the Bahamas National Trust. It's definitely a pleasure to welcome you all here this morning for the 7th session of the Bahamas National History Conference, an event sponsored by the Bahamas National Trust. This event promises to be extremely enlightening and informative as we strive to focus on a balance between our major industry being tourism and the activities related thereto. We're going to be looking at basically striking that balance between the ecotourism in the Bahamas. As we know, tourism in general is very important to the Bahamas, and there are a number of activities that we are engaged in today. And based on the pressures that we face, inclusive of our realities nowadays with the pandemic, people are becoming more and more desperate. And even so, more so than ever, we need to have a focus on managing our natural environment and the species there. Today, our panel of experts include a wealth of knowledge. We have Dr. Charles Knapp from Shared Aquarium, Dr. Susannah French from Utah State University, Dr. Charles Kwit from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, along with Dr. Graham Reynolds from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and Ms. Emma Doyle from Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, along with Mr. Stephen Cornett from the Bahamian Research and Education. Today, promises to be a very enlightening experiences. I've had the opportunity to view some of the abstracts, and we're going to be discussing various issues from the natural history of Conception Island to managing marine protected areas and interaction with various species. With that being said, and with all us eager to get along with the presentation, I will, without any further ado, I would like to turn the joint presentation, was focusing on basically finding the balance in ecotourism in the Bahamas. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Charles Knapp. And just for the record, this event is being recorded live on Facebook. Dr. Charles Knapp.
Thank you very much, Brent. And thank you all for joining this presentation virtually. This is a joint presentation with Dr. Susannah French and Dr. Charles Kwit. And so Susannah French is in charge of the PowerPoint, so I will be asking her to move forward when ready. Today, we are going to be speaking about tourism in the Bahamas and how our investigations on how it affects endangered Bahamian rock iguanas. Next slide, Susannah. I want to start with underscoring the significant rise in tourist visits to the country since 2009. There has been 52% increase in air and sea arrivals, culminating in a record-setting 7.2 million visitors in 2019. Next slide, Susannah. However, as research biologists studying iguanas in the Bahamas for up to 40 years, we haven't needed these statistics to recognize the increase in tourism because we've noticed it and noted it at our remote island study sites in the Iguanas for years. As general tourism has increased, so has tourism involving interactions with wildlife, including feeding experiences. As an example, Google swimming pigs of the Bahamas and you will understand what I mean. The effects of general tourism activities on animals has been studied in several species, and results have found that it could, but not always, negatively affect wildlife via modifications in behaviors, reduced body condition and reproductive rates, or changes in demography. Food provisioning, in particular, may decrease nutritional status over time and affect fitness, while also artificially inflating densities and increasing individual overlap, which could promote aggression and parasite transfer. Next slide, Susannah. Susannah, would you mind putting the full view slides? Apologies for that. We'll go to screen view. I will continue until when we can get that up. At any rate, I will continue so we don't slow down. Thank you, Susannah. Can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. So as I was, talking about food provisioning and tourism and food provisioning, but on the other hand, food provisioning can potentially have positive effects, like providing supplemental food during scarcity, while the close interactions between animals and people can foster compassion and potentially lead to conservation awareness and action. Therefore, the issue is complex because the socioeconomic benefits are vast, while the negative ecological outcomes uncertain. Next slide, Suzanne. Next slide, Suzanne. Thank you. So to address this issue and to better understand how tourism and feeding in the Bahamas impacts rock iguanas, our team, if you could go previous, Susanna, our team has conducted several comparative studies over the past decade to investigate differences in iguana populations that are visited and fed versus populations that are not visited by tourists or fed. And these studies are particularly important in rock iguanas because they're herbivorous and they eat primarily leaves, fruits, and flowers, yet are often fed inappropriate or unnatural food items like grapes, bread, meat, and even rice and beans. To date, we've investigated flight response, body size, growth, condition, and demography, and physiology and parasite loading. We have, unfortunately, even noted disturbing anecdotes like iguanas being punctured by skewers that have been left behind on beaches. And that's the picture to the right. Next slide, please. If you aren't familiar with rock iguanas and the exumas, we study two subspecies of the northern Bahamian rock iguana, Cyclura figgensi and Cyclura inornata, both of which are considered critically endangered according to the IUCN Red List criteria. Some populations have been under study for 40 years by John Iverson, and others for 20 years with myself. In that time, we've noted tourists increase from approximately 20 to 200 per day on leaf key in the Allens keys, and from 0 to 40 per day on bitter iguana key, to name only two. Next slide, Susannah. So after documenting health differences originally in 2013 between iguanas from tourist visited and non-visited keys, we expanded our team to include additional experts to help investigate more than just effect differences. Beyond the differences, we were interested in what are the impacts of tourism and food provisioning on rock iguanas. So therefore, two other team members are going to discuss recent elements of our work. Dr. Susannah French is going to discuss our work investigating the physiological impacts on individuals and populations of rock iguanas, while Dr. Charles Kwit is going to discuss the environmental impacts of feeding unnatural food to the largest native herbivore in the Bahamas. But before I begin, I do just want to stress that the motivation behind our research is to provide information that can inform a sustainable management plan for the industry to ensure that not only rock iguanas remain healthy, but that the livelihoods of people who depend on tourism remain sustainable. Our research group is a firm believer in including the human element in conservation. So with that, we'll begin with Dr. Susannah French. Susannah?
Thank you, Chuck. I promise to do a better job presenting than I am managing the slideshow. Well, as Chuck mentioned, we have recently been incorporating physiological approaches to conservation along with our more traditional population monitoring approaches that have been used for many years. And this has several key benefits. It provides fast detection of the health status of individuals within a population. And it also provides an understanding of how environmental changes or stressors in the environment affect individuals. And this understanding of how is really important for providing insight for management of these species moving forward. So what exactly are we measuring? Well, we're looking at the body condition of these animals as well as their ectoparasite prevalence using a bunch of different measures and ectoparasite counts. We're also looking at female clutch size. This is something that's really important because these females do not all breed every year. So this allows us to count or look at the proportion of breeding females within a given year using this high resolution ultrasound. We can also look at the size and the number of developing eggs throughout gestation. In addition, we're looking at hormones that are indicative of stress, as well as reproductive hormones that can tell us basically about reproductive condition. And we can do this by using a small blood sample collected from the caudal vein of the lizard. And the same blood sample can tell us something about the animal's immune system, but also oxidative stress. Now, oxidative stress is a more recent stress measure used in wildlife studies, and it's becoming increasingly important. This basically shows us the buildup of free radicals and the production of free radicals in the blood, which can cause tissue damage and have been linked to reduced survival in many species. So we can take this same small blood sample and take it either back to our lab, or what we're planning to do now is doing more and more of this on the boat in the Bahamas, and actually measure all of these different health indicators to get a more comprehensive view of health of these animals. So we're doing this across these different sites. We've got some populations like Leaf Key that Dr. Knapp talked about that has up to hundreds of people a day showing up to visit and feed the iguanas. We also have animals or sites adjacent that get moderate level, just day boaters, but still regular visitation and feeding. And we also have similar sites that are close by where people can't go. And usually it's because it's not accessible by boat or it's very challenging to get on. And so we're looking at this array of different physiological responses and also seed dispersal, which Dr. Kwit will be talking about later in this presentation. So what are we finding? Well, first, the first several graphs I'm going to be talking to you about, you'll see the females are denoted in pink and the males are in blue. And it's really important to look at these separately because their physiologies are very different. So this first graph is talking about oxidative stress. Again, looking at the production of free radicals. And what you can see is moving from left to the right of the screen, you're getting significant increases with increasing tourism in the production of these free radicals. And this is telling us that there is indeed an increased stress state at these high tourist sites. We're also seeing, not surprisingly, an increase in energy metabolites at these high tourist sites. These animals are supplementally fed every day. And so you see this both with triglycerides on the left and also glucose or blood sugar on the right. We're seeing significant increases with tourism. Now, finally, we are also looking at this hormone that's indicative of stress, corticosterone, because it's really important not just for stress, but just normal day activities. Its real main role is to free up energy reserves within the animals. And it does this if the animal encounters a stressor, but it also does it with just its daily activities. And so we actually get this inverse relationship, which may seem unexpected, but understanding what it does helps clarify that. So we're seeing lower levels at these high tourist sites because they have these high levels of circulating energy metabolites and they don't need to free up their own reserves. And that's what we think is going on in this case. But we wanted to take this one step further. What does it mean to have this daily increase in glucose levels that's not natural for these animals? And to do this, we did what's called a glucose challenge, which is basically a diabetic test that you would see in people or in pregnant women to look for or test for gestational diabetes. And what you do is you give a controlled dose of this glucose based on the animal's body mass, and you look at how well it can clear it from its blood over time. So looking at this graph, blood glucose is on the y-axis and the time since glucose treatment is on the x-axis. The green lines represent natural leaf-eating populations, and the purple are the tourist grape-fed populations. And what I want you to see is we're getting a significantly steeper increase in glucose initially, and it's staying significantly higher longer. And that is basically what you see in a human diabetic response. So it's really important for us to take this further and try to understand what this means for the long-term health of these animals. And this is something we're working on right now. Now, finally, one of the key things that's emerging in research and has been a really hot topic recently is in animals and also humans, gut microbial community. It's becoming increasingly clear that these gut microbes are really important for the overall health of animals and people. And we wanted to understand how dietary changes may be altering these gut microbes and then affecting physiology in turn. And just so you can see over on the right, that's a picture of the feces deposited at a tourist beach. You can see it's a very different consistency. Normally it's hard and almost cigar-like. So we're seeing definite changes there. So just really brief overview of this. So more recent findings, this is sort of ongoing research. This is looking at the microbial differences across these different populations. And what you can see is there's a clear distinction between the north and the south exumas across that line, which is not surprising. They're getting a big geographic distance, different environmental factors playing in there, but we're also seeing clustering based on feeding with high tourism, moderate tourism, and low tourism. So these significant tourist effects we do now know are impacting the gut microbiome, but moving forward, we're going to be looking at how this is then impacting these animals' health moving forward. So what can we say from this sort of data? Well, this will help us determine what sorts of populations are most susceptible, but perhaps more importantly, What makes populations more susceptible? Is it this elevated glucose and their inability to metabolize it well? Is that going to lead to chronic conditions? Or is elevated oxidative stress going to cause problems or reduce survival in the long term? But on a more general level, a bigger level, I should say, are these changes in the gut microbial community going to impact these animals' ability to germinate seeds? This is an important service role they play for the ecosystem, which could actually affect the island level, not just the animal. So I will pass it on to Charlie and promise to do a better job with the slides, Charlie.
All right, great. Thank you, Susannah, for that great segue into the final portion of our talk, which focuses on an aspect of iguana biology that we have known about for quite some time. It was our dear friend, colleague, and co-author, John Iverson, who noted back in the early 1980s that seeds from fruits consumed by Bahamian rock iguanas germinated quite well. So as the largest fruit-eating animal and the largest seed disperser in the Bahamas, we know that this animal can play an important role in the regeneration of plants whose fruits it consumes. So what John did not allude to in his 1985 paper was whether food provisioning could alter the seed dispersal effectiveness of iguanas. And this is the broad question that we have begun to address over the past few years. So perfect. So now to accomplish this, we have been taking advantage of every opportunity that we have with fresh scat encounters. So by scat, here's the fancy word for iguana poop, to look for seeds of native plants in them. I will show 3 examples here that together begin to paint a picture about whether or how food provisioning affects this important ecosystem service, with the ultimate goal being to provide management recommendations when and if necessary. So I think I'm ready for the next slide, Susannah. So what are we measuring here? So the 3 steps involved so far that I've been involved with include these. 1 involve the collection of fresh scat on food provisioned keys and non-food provisioned keys to see if the likelihood of finding native plant seeds in scat differed in those scenarios. The idea here is that we want to check to see if iguanas are still playing a role as seed dispersers of native plants on keys where they are being provided food. The second item is more concerned with what might be happening on food provision keys. So when iguanas are captured during our normal activities there, we note their location of capture. And during normal processing, a lot of the iguanas will defecate. So if you look closely in what Chuck's holding in his hands, he's holding an iguana scat right there. So here we're able to ask whether the likelihood of scat containing native plant seeds differed between what we call beach iguanas and non-beach iguanas from those food provision keys. And then third, we have been investigating if food provisioning itself can lead to scat deposition in unfavorable places like on the beach. We did this by counting scat on feeding or landing beaches and comparing those counts with counts on control beaches on the same keys where tourists do not conduct feeding. So let's see what we found. I think we're ready for the next slide. So in terms of scat found on keys during surveys, in good news, we found no differences in the probability of scats from food provision and non-food provision keys containing seeds of native plants. So the graph shows somewhere between 30 and 50% of scats that were encountered, fresh scats, containing native plant seeds. So the iguanas on food provision keys are at least fulfilling part of their role as seed dispersers. So I think we're ready for the next slide. In terms of scat from processed iguanas, on food provision keys, we found no differences in the probability of scats containing seeds as a function of whether the iguanas were beach iguanas or non-beach iguanas. So between 60 and roughly 80% of the iguanas that provided us scat in the work had seeds of native plants. So we do not have a case here where beach iguanas are not fulfilling their roles as seed dispersers of native plants. They all appear to be doing it, and so that's good. And now for the next slide here, we can point towards something that's a little different. So in terms of how the act of food provisioning may affect deposition of seeds in bad places, we have a slightly different story to tell. We found higher numbers of scat on feeding or landing beaches than on control beaches where feeding does not occur on these food provision keys. So if iguanas liked to defecate on beaches in general, we would have found similar amounts of scat on both types of beaches. But instead what we see here is a preponderance of scat on feeding beaches, which is not a good thing if you're a seed. So the last slide, I think, of mine is this final one. So let's go through really quickly the food provisioning's mixed results that we have. So to place our results in the framework of how food provisioning may be affecting the seed dispersal effectiveness of our Bahamian iguanas, we can say that it does not appear to affect what is referred to as the quantitative component of seed dispersal effectiveness. Iguanas on these food provision keys are still eating native plant fruits and dispersing their seeds. That's good. But it seems that food provisioning is negatively associated with a qualitative aspect of seed dispersal effectiveness, in that it is driving the dispersal of seeds to feeding beaches, which are not great locations for plant regeneration. So in terms of next steps, I hope we can continue along these lines to address something that John Iverson was interested back when in terms of, does germination and establishment of seeds that pass through the guts of iguanas and wind up in good places depend on whether food provisioning is involved. So the liquidy scat shown here in this slide, commonly found with food provisioned iguanas, may not provide those nutrients necessary for seedling establishment to take place. But that's a study that still needs to be undertaken. And I'm ready to hit the next slide and hand it over to our concluding remarks.
Thank you, Charlie. So I just want to conclude with not only a conclusion, but a way forward. And if you noticed in this presentation, we didn't specifically call on ecotourism. We didn't use that term because oftentimes it's conflated with either green tourism or adventure tourism or some other term. The definition of ecotourism refers generally to responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well-being of local people, and involves interpretation and education. Now, I'm unsure if most tourism that we witness in the exumas fits that definition at this time. There is, however, tremendous growth potential for expanding the traditional tourist experience in the Bahamas. Ecotourism is one of the fastest growing sectors in the tourism industry. It has an annual growth of 5% worldwide and expands 3 times faster than tourism in general. And these environmentally aware tourists, they seek experiences such as being in contact with local communities, learning from their ecosystems, and participating in conservation of their natural resources. So as Dr. Nair, who I believe is on this presentation, and I'm grateful for that, from the University of the Bahamas, he published a way forward for ecotourism. And he wrote that sites in the Bahamas can reap a return from their natural resources if operators managing these sites are directly involved with their conservation. And so this is where we ask for your help in involving the wider tourism community to work with us and others to think creatively about sustainable opportunities that showcase the perhaps less traditional yet amazing natural beauty of the Bahamas. And also, as Dr. Nair states, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the potential to adapt ecotourism tenets to current conservation practices in the exumas has potential to contribute to the viability and sustainability of the enterprise, while ensuring animal populations remain healthy. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. And I also want to acknowledge everyone who has been involved. Well, not even everyone, because there's more people that are on this slide, but this is a collaborative effort. And so we're grateful. And again, to try to foster communication, all of our contact information is below. And so we do encourage you to reach out to us, and we're happy to work with others. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that very timely and very informative presentation, Dr. Knapp and Dr. French. Very much appreciated. Some of the key elements that stuck out definitely were involving the human element and obviously sustainable development as we try to manage our resources effectively. And the show also is always a good thing when we can kind of balance things and show the economic benefits of sustainable development and the opportunities that are available. Also like to take this opportunity to remind our listeners that they can submit questions that will be read at the end of the sessions. Very important that we get some feedback and so we can assist in forging the way forward. And without any further ado, I would like to turn over the presentation to our next speaker, Dr. Graham Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brett. Let me share my screen. And can you see that?
It's visible.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you about one of the national parks in the Bahamas. I appreciate Dr. Knapp's concluding slide there talking about ecotourism and the potential to develop additional opportunities in the Bahamas in ways that allow people to experience some of the amazing places and wildlife in a way that's sustainable and contributes to the ongoing preservation of those areas. And I think that Conception Island National Park is a very good candidate for this type of model of sustainable ecotourism. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about this national park. It's one of the more remote national parks in the Bahamas. So it's an area that not a lot of people have visited. Nevertheless, I think that there are some very amazing things about it. So this will be a bit of a tour of one of the less visited national parks within the park system. Conception Island is located in the central Bahamas, and it is on its own island bank, as you can see here. We have a rather abbreviated history of Conception Island, and one of the reasons potentially is because it has gone by various names over the years. It's been referred to as San Salvador, as Little San Salvador, and as Little Island. And so, you know, when we try to go back through the history of this island, we often have to reconcile the different names that were used to refer to what we now call the Conception Island Bank. It's located sort of within this trio of additional island banks, including San Salvador and Rum Cay, both of which have also gone by different names in the past. And so, you know, we sort of have to sort all that out. It's located right next to Long Island, the closest large island, and then Cat Island is not too far. If we look at the bathymetry, you can see that the Conception Island Bank is very much on its own. We have the Great Bahama Bank in red that wraps around from Long Island all the way over to Cat Island. Conception Island there is adjacent to Rum Cay and San Salvador. All three of those are on their own island banks. And what that means is that these islands have not been connected to other islands historically. They're separated from each other by deep water, including extremely deep water in some cases, as you can see in the greens and yellows between, say, Conception and San Salvador. So this sets up some interesting scenarios with regard to not only accessibility of Conception Island. In order to get there, you have to cross very deep water, but also because of some of the interesting wildlife that occurs there. If we look at some of the historical aspects of Conception Island, one of the more interesting things is that a pair of warships crashed there during the War of 1812. An American warship was captured by the British and was in tow, I believe, to possibly to Jamaica. And they actually crashed on this very large reef that extends north from Conception Island itself. And we now call this Southampton Reef. This is a 4.5 mile long, relatively shallow reef. And both of those ships crashed out there in the middle and sank. And so some of the early records we have of visitations to Conception Island come from these shipwreck survivors who lived on this island for several weeks before they were rescued. And some of the artifacts from that wreck are still present out on Southampton Reef. Here you can see a photo of one of the cannons. This reef is not very well explored, so I think there's plenty of additional artifacts that are out there for intrepid divers and possibly even snorkelers. And it is a very nice, very long reef that extends north from there. Some of the other aspects of Conception Island worth noting are that it's a very important bird nesting area, including for tropic birds, which I'll show you in just a moment, as well as additional seabirds. And this is something that we've known about this island for quite a while, is its importance with regard to seabird nesting. Some additional history of human use of Conception Island. We do know that the Lucayans probably visited there or possibly lived there. There are some sherds that have been found on that island. Many of these islands in this region, we put Columbus ? We don't know exactly which islands Columbus might have visited, although we have some pretty good ideas. Of course, the Vixen and Southampton wrecks, that was a pretty interesting time period in terms of human use of the island. Those individuals, shipwreck survivors, would have lived for several weeks on Conception Island. We don't know what sorts of resources they might have used there during that time, but I anticipate that they certainly modified some of the habitat, if not gathered things to eat. And then we see this period of colonial leases during the 1800s and 1900s. And what I've been trying to do recently is track down some of the records of who was leased property on Conception Island. And I think the Dorset family from Rowan Key has come up as one of those families that was granted some land on Conception Island. The Dorset family is also comprised of additional surnames, including Knowles, Sweeting, and Pender. Those are names that would be familiar within the Bahamas. And it's possible that this individual, Austin Dorset, might have been one of the ones who owned land on Conception Island more recently. So if anyone has any knowledge about any of this, and if you're into genealogy, I'd love to hear from you. We're trying to figure out who exactly used this island, and is there any historical information about this island from that time period. There are ruins on the island from some of these, presumably some of these families that had land there, and those ruins are still visible today. They are, of course, part of the history of that island. And then in 1971, Conception Island was declared a national park. And that's where we pick up the story. I do want to point out one thing, and that is that Woodes Rogers, the governor, reported that the Spanish had a raiding fort on Cat Island. But when you hear Woodes describe, when you read Woodes's description of that raiding fort, it sounds a lot more like Conception Island, at least when you think about the way that Governor Woodes was describing it. So I wonder if it's possible that the Spanish could have even used Conception Island as a temporary raiding base. It's to be determined. A satellite view of Conception Island Bank shows the location of Southampton Reef extending north from the main island, Conception Island. And I want to point out a couple of features in this region, the first being West Bay. Anyone who has visited Conception Island has probably been to West Bay. That is, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of a lot of mariners, the only safe anchorage on this island bank. It is a beautiful spot, and in my opinion, one of the most beautiful places in the Bahamas, but it's the place where most people who would come to Conception Island would come to visit. And the types of folks who are visiting are folks who are in boats that they can stay aboard. Everything from very large yachts that we've seen out there with helicopters on the back deck to very small sailboats. And so at any given time, you might see one or even 3 or 4 boats in anchorage in West Bay. And so it's those lucky few that are the ones who are doing a lot of the visitation to Conception Island. If you look down towards the bottom of the image, you can see where the wall is. And there are some mooring buoys here that allow dive boats, mostly from Long Island, to come and do scuba diving on this wall, which is just spectacular. Those dive moorings, those buoys were installed via a public-private partnership whereby the moorings themselves were actually donated. And that provided the ability for dive boats to go and safely tie up to the buoys and conduct diving operations. And in fact, this for a while has probably been the way in which most people have gone to Conception Island, is via dive trips from Long Island and getting to dive that wall. Over on the right is the shallow shelf. In a lot of nautical charts, it will show that there is a safe anchorage between this small island of Booby Key and the main island of Conception Island. I do not agree that that is safe anchorage. The water there is very shallow. There's lots of patch reef. And so I think that mariners would need to be cautious going around that side of the island. Booby Key and East Rocks are both designated as protected seabird nesting sites. So those are areas that the Bahamas National Trust has identified as being crucial to nesting seabird activity, and probably not good candidates for ecotourism, unlike perhaps some of the other parts of Conception Island. Some of the habitats that are present there, we have a variety of habitats that you might expect to find on low-lying islands in the Bahamas. There's a large tidal creek that runs through the middle. This is an important area for a lot of juvenile green sea turtle research, which has been going on for a number of years. It's a very nice area for kayaking, for bird watching. Very nice tidal creek, very well protected. There's upland coastal scrub, which looks like very beautiful forest from this satellite photo, but alas is extremely difficult to walk through. Lots of poison wood, it's very dense growth, and it's challenging to even move through that forest. And then there's, of course, brackish ponds and mangroves. The middle of Conception Island is very marshy, and it has a number of these ponds right through the middle, and then you see most of the upland habitat around the margin of Conception Island. And indeed, one of the better ways to explore Conception Island is to actually walk the beach. And you can do a complete circuit of the island in a day. It takes about 4 to 5 hours, depending on how fast you want to go. And involves a little bit of wading, but that's a very nice way to see the entire island and see all those different habitats. There are a number of different plant communities on the island, so I want to show you some photos of what some of these look like. We have sea lilies and sea oats growing in certain areas. This is over by West Bay, a very nice little bluff that looks out across some of these beautiful patch reefs. There are small patches of forest, including gamelame trees and silver palms, Cocothrinax. These are old growth gamelame trees that have survived for quite a while. And they provide some interesting forest habitat, sort of, classic coppice forest, but with some of these larger gamelames. If you climb that bluff from West Bay, you can get a nice view across the island. So this is, if you were to come ashore at West Bay, this is probably where you would land. And you can see a variety of these habitats here. You can see the coastal scrub, lots and lots of silver palms. You can see additional plants like coca sea grapes, and so forth. And you can see there's a little bit of upland habitat too. So there are some areas that are a bit more elevated. It's not completely flat. There's some topography there. Some additional habitats, there's some grasses and some additional Cocothrinax palm forest in the background, and then some Coca uvifera, the sea grapes in the foreground. So again, a variety of different habitats provide a wealth of natural resources for a lot of different wildlife that occurs there. It also makes for very beautiful scenery. Brackish ponds surrounded by mangroves in some cases, and then you can see the transition from these ponds up to the upland habitat. These ponds are very good habitat for a number of different wading birds. We've seen all kinds of different ones using these ponds. Some of them are relatively permanent, and some, like this one, are more ephemeral. This pond tends to dry out and then be filled in again year over year. And so any given time that we're out there visiting, we tend to check on the water level, and it does fluctuate a lot. This pond is one in which we've seen whistling ducks visit. And so a number of different birds will use these kinds of habitats. They're rather important out there. Another view from a bluff shows you that some of the elevation that's present out there on the Conception Island bank. You can see in the foreground some love vine, and then looking out across the distance, you see those Cocothrinax forests, and then some of the grasses and these really beautiful beaches. This is a spectacular place to visit. Which is one of the reasons why I want to show photos. Some of the amazing wildlife that's out there. One of my personal favorite species of birds is the tropic bird. Again, this is an important nesting area for tropic birds. Let's see if the video plays so you can experience these majestic animals. So that gives you not only a view of tropic birds, but also a little bit of a view of some of the nearshore marine habitat. And you can see those patch reefs right along here that I'll show you in just a moment as well. So very important seabird area, some excellent bird watching opportunities, really a phenomenal place for those kinds of activities. If you go down beneath the waves, then you'll see a number of different, typical nearshore marine creatures and habitats. Stoplight parrotfish being, a common inhabitant. A number of different corals. The reefs here are, well, you would say somewhat healthy. It's hard to sort of determine what a healthy reef is. We have some colleagues, of course, who are much better at that. But there are a number of corals here, some very nice brain corals and such, but you can also see a preponderance of macroalgae that's present. So like many reefs in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas, we do see that the reefs have changed rather significantly over the last 20 to 30 years. And Conception Island, even though it's remote, is no exception. For example, a very large Acropora colony that's right off the beach. This particular colony was probably 30 feet across. And you can see that the majority of it is dead. There are a few pieces of Acropora that are still alive in the foreground, for example, and then in the mid background. But the colony itself is mostly overgrown with gorgonians and macroalgae and a few other colonies of brain corals. Another set of Acropora in the background that have been overgrown by gorgonians. And this is sort of a typical shallow water marine scene in the Bahamas. And I show you this to show you that Conception Island has the same kinds of reef changes that are being experienced elsewhere in the Bahamas. This is a video showing a swim through, and I want to show you this to show you the size of this colony of Acropora that was there. And you can see the live piece that's right there. You can see all the gorgonians. You can see some additional sponges and corals that have colonized this colony after it died. So a few decades ago, there would have been some really spectacular Acropora colonies at Conception Island Bank. Now you can see the skeletons of those colonies now being overgrown. Additional terrestrial wildlife, there's some really interesting ones. This is what we refer to as a Cuban tree frog. As you can see, if anybody's seen this species before, you might look at this and say, well, that looks unusual. One of the things that we see in terms of the terrestrial herpetofauna on Conception Island Bank is that some of them get very, very large. So this individual is a typical sized Cuban tree frog from Conception Island Bank, and you can see it's enormous. And it has a very unusual sort of mossy coloration. Many of the individuals look like this. They're huge, obviously well-fed, and they have these interesting color patterns. So we start to sort of, in the work that we do is mostly on the terrestrial wildlife, and we're starting to characterize the wildlife out there on Conception Island and finding some really unusual aspects. Some of the reptiles, the lizards, Anolis sagrii on the left. If anybody's seen this species before, this is called the brown anole, found all over the Bahamas and elsewhere in the Caribbean. But what you might notice about this individual, if you've seen brown anoles before, this male has a flap of skin called the dewlap that's being extended. And the dewlap in this individual is rather orange colored. This is a much lighter coloration than you would see in many other populations of Anolis sagrii elsewhere in the Bahamas. So the animals out there on Conception Island Bank have an unusually colored dewlap. In addition to that, they have what, in many cases, they have enlarged crests on their back. And so this individual is showing extra skin on the tail. That's called a tail crest. That's a bit unusual in this species. And the Anolis sagrii on Conception Island Bank are among the largest brown anoles in the entire Caribbean. So for whatever reasons that we're still investigating, the brown anoles on Conception Island Bank grow significantly larger than in brown anoles almost anywhere else where they occur. And that includes Bahamas, Cuba, Cayman Islands, Central America. It's a very large range. So there's some interesting things going on out there. On the right, you see what's called a dwarf gecko. This is Spherodactylus nigropunctatus. a very beautiful dwarf gecko, a nocturnal species, very nice spotting pattern. Some of the brown anoles that we've seen out there have unusual color patterns, like this individual. This is a female with some very red coloration, very unusual red coloration. And I want to point out that we have decided to do some interesting things with the research that we do out there. In particular, we are using a brown anole from Conception Island as the reference genome for the entire species Anolis sagrii. So if you go visit the Anolis sagrii on Conception Island, you'll see not only those unusual features like their large body size, some of these unusual colors and the dewlap colors, but also you can appreciate that these will now be the individuals that have contributed their genome to science. Other lizard species, this is Liocephalus, the curly-tailed lizard. There are a few of these, not a very large population out there, and we don't know that much about this species. This is the one we think also occurs on San Salvador and Rum Cay, those neighboring banks in the Bahamas. And again, I want to point out that the terrestrial wildlife, these lizards, would have had to have arrived at Conception Island via dispersal over water because Conception Island was not connected to another island in the past. It's surrounded by deep water. In 2015, we discovered a new species of boa from Conception Island. We named it the silver boa. This is a species that's entirely endemic to Conception Island. So a large terrestrial reptile that is only found on Conception Island and nowhere else. It also happens to be one of the most endangered boas in the entire world. This is a critically endangered boa, probably only a few hundred of these left. But it serves to underscore the importance of Conception Island, the uniqueness of the wildlife that exists there, and you know, some of the ways in which we can appreciate Bahamian wildlife by visiting this region. There's a juvenile. These boas are feeding on migratory songbirds. So we have the migration of songbirds passing through Conception Island. Sometimes those birds will stop to rest on Conception Island, and that is a dangerous thing for them to do because that's when the snakes might be able to grab them. This is the feathers of a Cape May warbler that this boa tried to catch but missed. Just got the feathers. Some interesting invertebrates out there, tailless whip scorpions, that's ambipligid on the left. And then this is you know, one of the Bahamas tarantulas that's on the right, and we don't have records of these that I'm aware of, official records of that species being on Conception Island, but they're definitely there. Conception Island, in the time that we've been visiting it, you know, we're one of the few research groups that's going out there with any regularity. And so not only are we characterizing the wildlife, but we're also trying to think about how the island might be changing. And so we were fortunate to be able to go and visit before and after Hurricane Maria Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. And this is looking across one of the beaches, and you can see this rack line here full of rocks that have been tossed up by the hurricane. We also see changes in the vegetation following hurricane. This is the Gamelame forest before and after. These photos were taken within a few weeks of each other, before and after Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. Now, these kinds of forests, Gamelame and silver palm, these are well adapted to hurricane impacts. So the defoliation that occurs during a hurricane recovers rather quickly. So it looks very dramatic, and you can see that here. This is my colleague, Dr. Puente, and in the background, you can see the defoliation that's occurred following Hurricane Joaquin, but these forests will rebound from that fairly quickly. So that's not the concern. What is a concern is that we have seen some significant erosion following that major hurricane. And so the erosion happened to be in some of this forest habitat that is good habitat for the boas. And so we are slightly concerned about that the frequency of storms and the intensity of storms driven by climate change that will be passing through this region and how that might impact Conception Island. One of the things we're also concerned about is that when people go out there, they do so in a way that's respectful of the environment. We have seen evidence of, this is a pile of flares that were used on Conception Island, but we certainly don't need any kind of fire being brought out there, whether it's campfires or flares. And so if we can sort of think about ways to encourage appropriate use of these areas, these remote areas. That will be very important. And we've taken a couple of initiatives in partnership with the Bahamas National Trust, including we're going to be installing new signs out on Conception Island that will be providing instructions for appropriate use of the island. Those are, hopefully we'll get those in next year. Supposed to be this year, but hopefully by next year those signs will be installed. And we're also worried about people bringing animals with them. And so one of the things that concerns us about terrestrial wildlife and plants, seabirds, et cetera, is the introduction of invasive species. So mice, rats, and cats are particularly damaging to these remote island ecosystems. And so we want to avoid the introduction of those creatures. So we need to be careful in how we manage visitation to Conception Island. And that's going to start with education of folks who would like to go out there. And so as part of our work, we do try to monitor whether there's been any introductions of these species. So we use camera traps, like the one you're seeing here attached to the palm tree, to monitor for invasive species. We use additional methods as well. So far, we've detected mice, island conservation detected mice. That's unfortunate, but not surprising. So far, we don't have any detection, at least confirmed detection of rats or cats, which is excellent, but we certainly don't need those animals being introduced out there. We also want to encourage folks that would visit Conception Island to do so, if they have pets with them, to be very respectful about having those pets in this area, very sensitive ecological area. Dogs can be very damaging. Of course, cats are extremely damaging. And just to point out, 2 species of Conception Island animals are now serving as the animals that are donating their genomes to science. So the silver boa and the brown anole. These individuals are going to be serving as the reference animals for the genomes of these 2 species. So, you know, here you have this remote island, and yet it is contributing in very large ways to some big initiatives in science, conservation, biology, et cetera. And this is in collaboration with Dr. Anthony Geneva at Rutgers. So Conception Island is an incredibly beautiful place, to summarize. It's full of fantastic wildlife, beautiful scenery. It's just an amazing, amazing national park. It's a real jewel of the national park system in the Bahamas. It's worth appreciating, and hopefully there are going to be ways that we can encourage sustainable visitation to Conception Island so that more people can experience this amazing, amazing place. I'd like to thank various sources of funding and support for our work in Conception Island. Again, it's remote, it's hard to get there, and it requires a fair amount of effort to go and work out there. So thank you to those funding agencies. And I want to end by saying thank you to the Bahamas National Trust. The National Trust does such amazing work. They are so integral to the preservation of wildlife in the Bahamas and of natural areas. They're just crucial to this mission. And so I want to thank them for the partnership in working in Conception Island and elsewhere in the Bahamas. And I hope that others will support the National Trust as best they can, especially in these difficult times. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for that wonderful presentation. Very, very, very informative example. Definitely highlighting some of the potentials of the Bahama Islands, and also linking in some very key factors, such as things that can be incorporated into basically effective management of our sensitive environment, such as like establishment of more moorings, and definitely looking at things like invasive species that there's definitely a lot of national attention on, as well as other factors. As a reminder, for example, one of the things that we want to highlight as well is that it was noted that there are a lot of artifacts around in terms of from shipwrecks. We have had some issues in the Bahamas with people removing artifacts, so it is definitely against the law to remove any artifacts from any wrecks found in the Bahamas. There is a moratorium in place regarding that as well. So that's just as a side note. In terms of persons moving forward, there's always definitely that lure to touch, but there are provisions in national laws that speaks against it. But definitely in terms of the opportunities and highlighting the beauty and the beauty of the islands is very much appreciated, Dr. Graham. I'd also like to make note of Dr. Witt. I know I acknowledged him previously, but I also wanted to make sure and I thank him as well for his participation in the previous presentation as well. I'd like to take this opportunity as we move along to highlight the national history of the Bahamas book. The book is a field guide specializing in an ultra comprehensive guide of terrestrial and coastal flora and fauna, including species and common names and locations and detailed description. The book was actually established by local experts in Bahamian ecology with contribution from many experts, over 30 naturalists and researchers, and covers organisms studied in the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos Islands with more than 700 photos. The publication is available for sale in the Providence at Locals Bookstore, media enterprises, as well as national park offices that the BNT manages. The book also can be purchased online at Cornell University and online book retailers such as Amazon for Kindle, instantly and by email. It should be noted that all royalties from the book sales benefit the Bahamas National Trust. So it is actually an excellent way to support the BNHC. I want to thank again Dr. Graham for his kind words towards the Bahamas National Trust. And with that in mind, I'd also like to further this group presentation and turn it off to our next panelist, Dr. Emma Doyle, who's going to enlighten us about the management of marine protected areas and basically some interaction with some Pacific species. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Doyle.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be with you, and I'm very pleased to tell you about a pilot study that's helping MPA managers, our marine protected area managers, to explore a new way of monitoring tourism interactions with wildlife through social media. I'm going to tell you about how we designed this study, what we learned about how visitors show themselves interacting with wildlife, what operators are promoting in social media, and I'll demonstrate how such a pilot study could help guide possible management actions. Now, this work comes under a partnership between MPA Connect and the Bahamas National Trust. MPA Connect is a regional initiative of NOAA, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, working with 32 MPAs in 11 Caribbean countries and territories that you can see here on the screen. We work to share best practices and to help address the needs of MPA managers on the ground. Now, we've worked with DMR, with BNT, and with their many excellent partners since 2011. We come from this MPA management perspective, and we're accustomed to doing solid science. You know, we monitor marine habitats. We monitor the status of commercially important species of fish. We do research into globally and nationally important biodiversity like sea turtles or sharks or seabirds, and into invasive species like lionfish. But managing parks is in large part about managing people. So we do also monitor the impacts of people on habitats and on the species that we seek to protect. And typically this means things like monitoring water quality to measure pollution, maybe monitoring seagrass to look for impacts of anchoring, or checking corals for impacts of snorkelers standing on reefs. You know, MPAs might keep track of the numbers of visitors they receive. Many places have economic evaluations of the contributions of these visitors. But when it comes to actually monitoring visitor behaviour, that's always been somewhat of a challenge. Now we're living in a world of supercharged communications with billions of people on sharing platforms like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, just to name a few. And we're seeing that social media is driving this incredible thirst for bucket list experiences and a craze for the ultimate wildlife selfies. That in turn is driving a new form of tourism based around close-up interaction with wildlife. And this has spawned the hand feeding of animals in order to artificially attract and maintain aggregations of the species of interest for tourism purposes. As our previous speakers have mentioned in relation to iguanas, this potentially brings new stresses to wildlife. It can have new impacts on the environment, and it can cause new tensions with the economically important tourism industry. Now, don't get me wrong, MPA managers want to see sustainable livelihoods options based around non-extractive use of marine natural resources. But managers from across the Caribbean, who are officially mandated with biodiversity protection, are telling MPA Connect that they're concerned about these impacts of wildlife selfies. And I'm hearing this from Mexico to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and including the Bahamas. The managers are asking, when and how do we know if the situation requires our intervention? Now, when you operate in a conservation world with scarce resources, you need more than a hunch or anecdotal information to justify investing money and taking time in actually taking management action. So we approach this issue like we approach some of the, say, coral and fish monitoring, and we applied the same sort of framework. So firstly, we determined the management question. We asked, does human behaviour in interaction with the species of interest require management intervention? Now, the species we considered in this social media study are the Bahamian rock iguana, the nurse shark, the green sea turtle, and of course the swimming pigs. Now, next we considered what indicator to select. And this is the innovative part of what we did. You know, where normally our indicators might be trends in animal populations or the health of individuals, like the excellent work on iguanas, we instead decided to use posts on social media as our indicator. The data is readily accessible and there's no expensive field work, and doing the analysis doesn't require a lot of time or any really specialist skills to do. So back to our monitoring framework. So for management purposes, we needed to define a target for our indicator. And for this first pilot study, we said our target is that the proportion of the posts showing best or acceptable practices exceeds the proportion of posts showing poor practices. Okay, then to answer the question of when management action would be required, we defined a trigger. We said that if there are more posts of poor practices than best practices, then an investment in targeted management action is justified. Okay, that's for the purposes of our pilot. Now, probably a question coming to mind is, are there best practices for interacting with these animals? Well, for some species, there are, like marine mammals and whale sharks and manta rays. There are good established sort of best practices. But for our purposes, we needed to design a methodology that would enable comparison between these different Bahamian species. And we don't have best practice guidelines always to go by. So we defined a set of pilot codes for what we called best or more acceptable and poorer or less acceptable practices based on things like the proximity of the animals and the humans, different types of physical contact that people are having with the animals, and whether there's active feeding of the animals. Then to find relevant posts on social media, we identified geographic areas where the wildlife tourism occurs. We identified relevant hashtags, and we researched some of the user handles that are being used by the tour operators. Then we reviewed a sample of about 1,000 Instagram posts of the species of interest and coded them. We chose posts that were no earlier than 2018, no later than the end of March 2020, and we tallied up the findings by codes. Now, we were pretty conservative in our processing of doing this. You know, we asked, would this stand up in court? And we only coded something if it was really clear. Now, multiple codes were possible. So like this partial image from Instagram that you can see here clearly has children in it. So we'd score it once for children, and we'd also give it a tally under code 8 for holding or lifting the animal. Now, when we looked at the findings, we especially considered the total of these first 3 codes, which we defined as kind of the best or the more acceptable practices. You know, the animal is on its own in the picture, people are on a boat or on a structure and not up close with the animal. or the people are at a distance than, say, more than 1 meter or like an arm's length, and none of the poor practices were shown. Now, the common poor practices were touching and holding and chasing and feeding and crowding of the animals. We also wanted to check for signs of animal aggression. So we had a code for that, for tagging things like biting or rearing at people. And we were thinking of visitor safety. So we also reviewed how close children are getting to the animals and whether people are posting about injuries that they've sustained from their interaction. Now, you might be thinking, this is kind of biased by the type of people who take these photos. Well, yes, and that's exactly who we want to monitor. Those people who want to interact with wildlife and will go to the lengths necessary to get their ultimate selfie. So what did we find? I'm going to tell you in turn about the iguanas, then the nurse sharks, then sea turtles, and then the pigs. But as I talk about results and some possible management actions, please remember that this is a pilot study, and we primarily want to explore the monitoring approach and demonstrate whether it has potential application to help guide management action. All right, so let's look at the iguanas. We found that the greatest proportion of the Bahamian rock iguana posts showed an animal alone with no people in the photos, and that was in 42% of the posts. This was the highest proportion of the posts of just the animal among all the species that we examined. We found that the iguana posts showed the least touching of the animals of all the species, with only 7% of posts showing that. And perhaps these findings together confirm that iguanas are indeed the least cuddly of the species, but that they're still visually dramatic. Now, looking at the posts that show best practices, better or more acceptable practices, it seems that the visitors kind of behave better with iguanas than the behaviour that the tour operators promote through their own posts, because we found that 45% of the visitor posts and only 33% of the operator posts show best practices. Now, the operators also show proportionately more touching and holding and more feeding of iguanas in their posts. So thinking back to our management target, the posts by the overall visitors are reasonably close to our target of at least getting half of the posts to show best practices. But we're not there yet, and if we apply our trigger point, then our results suggest that some management action is justified. Further, our results highlight that an indicated management action could be to communicate to operators that iguana visitors seem quite content with a photo of the animal on the beach, and that visitors place less importance on that close-up interaction with the iguanas than perhaps the operators are expecting. This might make for a quick win for enhancing protection of an endemic and ecologically important endangered species. Certainly there's a win-win for the operators who don't need to try so hard to achieve iguana interaction and invest in that for their visitors. Okay, let's look at nurse sharks then. This is the native species where we found the greatest proportion of posts showing people physically touching the animal in 19% of the overall images. Did you notice that we had a code for posts showing the species out of its natural setting? This would mean the animal is like wholly or partially out of the water, up on a boat or in a wharf or a dock. We found a greater proportion of these sort of posts for nurse sharks than for any other species in 9% of the nurse shark posts. But these two codes together perhaps indicate a management concern that among the native marine species in this study, sharks are bearing the brunt of the physical interaction with tourists, with 27% in total of the posts showing one of those two. Now, similarly to what we saw with iguanas, the tour operators are posting a smaller proportion of best practice images than are the overall visitors, at 35% best practice from the operators and 47% overall. And the operators are also showing more touching of the nurse sharks than the visitors do. But interestingly, the posts of nurse sharks by the overall visitors were most likely to show just the animal alone with no people, at 27% of posts. So perhaps like the iguanas, there's an opportunity to communicate to operators that they don't need to put nurse sharks in the visitors' faces so much. Half of the time, visitors seem happy just to see and swim with and to photograph the nurse sharks. So the operators can just let the visitors loose in the water to swim and get their photos that way. Now let's turn to sea turtles. Nationally protected, globally threatened. And it's important to acknowledge that what sets sea turtles apart here is that they're a migratory species and a regionally shared resource. Doesn't just belong to the Bahamas, but they're in our care for part of their endangered lives. Now, we found a couple of interesting things. Firstly, that the greatest amount of active feeding of any species was shown in posts of sea turtles at 35% of the posts, which is almost twice as much as the number of posts shown of people feeding the swimming pigs. So excuse me saying they're eating like pigs, but that's where that one comes from. We also found people touching, holding, restraining, or chasing turtles in just over 20% of the sea turtle posts. You know, this close interaction with sea turtles perhaps confirms that overriding appeal of getting the bucket list turtle selfie. We found that turtles were actually the species where visitors overall posted the smallest proportion of best practices at just 16%. And that's actually the same level as we found for swimming pigs. So there's sort of equally poor treatment of sea turtles as for pigs. Now, based on the trigger that we identified for this study, we could say that management action is justified. Now, on a more positive note, we found that the operators themselves actually post more best practices than the visitors. Okay, we have to remember that the operators are the ones providing the food, but clearly turtle feeding is the tourism sector's response to consumer demand. And we get that there's a trade-off to stimulate tourism as an alternative to a turtle harvest. But it is a potential management concern that a known bad practice is the predominant image circulating in the social media world about Bahamian turtles. You know, after hearing about diabetes in iguanas from Dr. French, turtles in cholesterol is actually an issue, and there are long-term impacts of lipidosis from an unnatural diet for that life stage of turtles. Can have impacts when the turtles are under stress, maybe like during migration. Habituating turtles to humans can increase capture when they migrate through other waters where there is still a legal open harvest. And the proliferation of poor practices in social media undermines the best efforts of others in the region who are trying to promote sustainable tourism. Now, for constructive management guidance, what the pilot sea turtle findings perhaps highlights is that there's an opportunity for managers to work with operators and together to provide better visitor education. You know, there's scope to train tour operators in best practices for wildlife interaction, maybe to develop a code of conduct for visitors and operators. Now that this tourism sector is established based on feeding of turtles, perhaps the break with COVID represents an opportunity for sea turtle tourism to evolve with better practices and to build a more sustainable experience. Now, okay, last but not least, let's look at what we found out about the swimming pigs. Firstly, we found the greatest amount of touching, holding, lifting, restraining animals with their paws half up on boats among the posts of the swimming pigs, with about 38% in total. There were proportionately the fewest posts showing best practices, same as sea turtles at 16%. So we could say that the visitors are not necessarily behaving well with the pigs. And the best practices are posted slightly more by the operators themselves than by the overall visitors at 20% versus that 16, sorry, 17 is a typo. Of all the species, there are the fewest images of pigs on their own, and those images are more likely to be posted by operators than by the visitors, which of course confirms that unrelenting demand for the pig selfie. Do we sacrifice pigs for tourism dollars? Perhaps this is at the expense of more authentic tourism experiences based on native Bahamian biodiversity. As copycat pig beaches appear around the world, the Bahamas could be losing that competitive advantage. You know, there are risks and liability issues from pig aggression towards visitors, which we actually felt was underestimated through social media, but we did find some 2% of images showing that for the pigs. There's also a risk of potential poor public relations just related to animal ethics from some of the images. From an MPA management perspective, we might think that the pig tourism eases pressure on, you know, other protected or endangered and significant species. But it's worth noting that the same visitors typically interact with several species on a tour, and there's a risk that poor pig practices are carried over to the other endemic, threatened and protected species. perhaps it's really a tourism management question and a community decision about what we want sustainable tourism to look like. Now, in summary, we can make a couple of possible recommendations from this pilot. Based on the pilot targets and the triggers that we identified, management intervention would be justified. With more information, these targets obviously could be refined and updated over time. The findings provide insight on how and where to target communications campaigns in order to improve practices. The iguanas and the sharks are perhaps closest to our target, turtles the furthest at the moment, but in all cases there's a unique opportunity to rebuild stronger. The study can be repeated at regular intervals as tourism returns, and to measure the impact of any operator training or visitor education. In the process of perusing more than 1,000 social media posts, we also saw that there are some possible emerging wildlife interaction issues, like with sea stars, and there's native birding appearing in native bird feeding appearing in the images. So to conclude, conservation is chronically underfunded, and this is a low-cost method of monitoring, and it's ideal that visitors provide their own monitoring data. You know, the method proved quite insightful, it's real world, and it's a current read, and it can actually help indicate some relevant associated follow-up research that might be needed. Now, the method is repeatable for ongoing observations to track trends, and over time we can learn more from those trends. The method would enable comparison with other locations that have wildlife tourism. And it's innovative. You know, we did this at a time when many marine protected areas are only just sort of building their own social media presence. And social media can actually be key in promoting respect and safety for wildlife. So new capacity among MPA managers for this sort of social media monitoring can also help to inform, to target, and to deliver an effective communications response. Well, thank you for listening. I hope it's been interesting and demonstrated what can be achieved with an innovative take on monitoring. We welcome your comments and queries, and especially your constructive suggestions as we work to refine this new monitoring approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doyle, for a very informative and lively presentation. Example, definitely highlighting the need for the management of human behavior, obviously highlighting the need for education and awareness for operators and visitors alike, and appreciate also your focus on definitely it's not the objective to basically stop the flow of economic growth, but to ensure that there is a sustainable development with all activities that we do. And definitely the recommendation on issues like code of conducts and monitoring these areas. And it just shows the potential and the work that has to be done and moving forward to ensure that our resources and species alike are managed in an effective way. I'd also like to remind viewers that they please do take note of your questions, as we will be addressing those in due course. And moving along, like I say, with definitely some very informative information, I'd just like to turn it over to Mr. Stephen Cornett from the Farming Island Research and Education, who will be blessing us with some additional information. Mr. Cornett, the floor is yours.
Hang on, I got to get the screen going. Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. Here we go. Stop it. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Knapp, and I'm here with Barbara Crouchley, and we want to thank the Bahamas National Trust for sponsoring this series of seminars and this coronavirus problem. And I want to thank all of you who are managing to hang in to this last presentation. Barbara and I run the Family Island Research and Education Program in the Bahamas. All our turtle research work is done with the Archie Carr Center for Sea Turtle Research at the University of Florida. And all our education work, or almost all of it, is done in cooperation with the Bahamas National Trust. Now, I hope all of you recognize a Bahamian sea turtle when you see it. This is our logo that we are quite proud of and we use all the time. This morning, I want to talk about sea turtle tourism in the Bahamas. There are not a lot of really good statistics. Doyle has managed to collect some, at least on public media, which I think is very important. So most of my information comes from personal observation and from conversations and work with Spanish Wells and Long Island eco tour guides. For the past couple of decades, the Bahamas has done really a lot to conserve sea turtles. I think most of you are familiar with this. There's been a total ban since 2009 on the harvest of sea turtles and sea turtle eggs. The system of MPAs that is being developed will surely make further difference. MPAs are obviously a wonderful technique, a tool for fisheries management. There's increased enforcement with the appointment of 27 new Family Island fisheries officers, so that almost every island now has a fisheries officer, which is good for both education and for enforcement. And there's an education effort really throughout the Family Islands that's been going on for a long time. The public school curricula, Bahamas National Trust Discovery Clubs, ourselves, Brief, Friends of the Environment, the Island School, Department of Marine Resources with their fisheries enforcement workshops. Brief has a series of workshops that it conducts with the Royal Bahamas Defense Force and so on. And these educational efforts are really beginning to make a difference. Despite this, there is still continued illegal harvest, boat strikes, plastic refuse, and habitat destruction that continues. We have two ways of learning about illegal harvest, which is still the biggest problem. One is when we come across the remains of turtles that have been slaughtered. And the other, which we have discovered is really very useful and also fairly entertaining. We try and get in about 20 different Family Island schools during the year. And at the beginning of every presentation, I'll tend to raise my hand and say, how many people in the room have eaten sea turtles? And I can raise my hand because I used to eat sea turtles before it was illegal. And as the case in this picture, as many as half the kids will raise their hands. And you say, well, we're not sure if that's really accurate because, you know, the kids may be raising their hands because the other guy raised their hands because I got my hand raised. So I'll pick on a couple of kids and I'll say, okay, what species of sea turtle did you eat? And the kid will say, green turtle. Then I'll say, well, how was it cooked? Oh, my Grammy steamed that up. Boy, it was so good. And when you ask questions like that and get that kind of response, it gives their answers real credibility. So we are actually recording these statistics now, and it gives us a good indication of harvest throughout the islands. Now, despite that, I think there's really quite a lot of hope for the future. Green turtle and hawksbill populations are increasing, and we know that because we're taking surveys throughout the Bahamas over time. There's a growing interest in sea turtles, not just the tourists that we're talking about, but we find that Bahamian people themselves take more interest in just simply looking at the turtles and are happy that they're coming back. The increased enforcement has started to make a difference. There's one of the fisheries officers in West End, Grand Bahama, who has made several arrests and actually gotten the cases to the magistrate, and fines have been issued. So the enforcement is beginning to have an impact. And I feel myself that with caution and with more information, and as Emma says, with better practices, I think turtle tourism in the Bahamas can be a win-win for the local economy and for the turtles. And that's what I'm going to discuss now. Just to give you an idea of the extent of turtle tourism, this is based really on my own observations and, as I say, conversations with local officials and guides. But the administrator's office in Spanish Wells, Southampton, there are 21 active boats, all licensed, inspected. They even have liability insurance operating out of Spanish Wells full-time. Harbor Island, probably 2 or 3 boats. Farmers Key down in the Iguanas doesn't have any boats of their own, but they get 5 to as many as 10 of the tour boats visiting per day during the season to see them feed turtles. Georgetown and the Iguanas, there are several tour companies that take people up the Iguanas to see the iguanas and the nurse sharks and things you've been hearing about. But also they stop in Little Farmers to see the turtles. Long Island, there are now 8 licensed boats. And obviously there are tour guides, bonefish guides, etc., in many of the other islands that include seeing turtles on their tours. And then one thing that's become increasingly important in the turtle tourism is that a lot of recreational boats and yacht tenders will go to these feeding stations and participate. So that increases the numbers, I would say, probably almost doubles in some cases. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Bottom Harbor, which has become a feeding station for Spanish Wells and Harbor Island boats who take tourists out to see sea turtles. They have found an area that is really ideal. It's sort of, you can see wading depth, and the water's crystal clear. There's a reasonable lee from most of the winds, and the tourists just love it. It's the boys come and almost everybody is feeding the turtles. So the turtles tend to aggregate in that area, and you can depend on them coming. As soon as you come in, which we've done several times ourselves to see this operation, the turtles will start coming up to your boat as soon as they hear the outboard. And this picture gives you an idea how many turtles will actually come right up to your boat. And if you're in the water, you might get even that many of turtles just swimming around you. Here we are feeding them squid. And one of the, I'll go through this first. And if you go swimming with them, they'll come right up to you and you actually have to sort of push them aside a little bit. So the tourists are getting a really lovely experience with the turtles, if you look at it in the best sense. Now, the advantages to this, I think a lot of us are, you know, there's a very good income for independent operators. The boats can charge $500 to $1,200 a day, depending on their size and the number of people. And, you know, if they operate for 100 days, that gives them, you know, they can make a gross income well over $100,000 a year, which is very, very good in the family islands. This tourism offers diversity for the local economies. In Spanish Wells, for example, which is the crawfish capital of the Bahamas, the crawfish fleet is shrinking. It's harder and harder to make money on crawfish. So a lot of the men that are working in the eco-tour industry are commercial fishermen who have either changed jobs completely or are doing it part-time. And so this is new business. It also has spillover in the sense that, you know, you have people coming into the island to participate in this activity. They're renting buggies, they're going out for lunch, they're going out for dinner, they're buying souvenirs and so on. So it's very healthy for the Spanish Wells economy. I'm hoping that this increase in interest in the turtles and getting commercial fishermen out of the commercial fishing, this may reduce overfishing and illegal harvest of turtles, particularly since the operators now see tremendous value in live turtles as opposed to harvested turtles. You have the advantage of education. Bahamian citizens are being educated as part of this. The tour guides are getting educated. As I said, all the NGOs and the government are giving a lot of attention to conservation education in the Family Islands. And the tourists are being educated and obviously carrying that interest in the environment away with them, and then hopefully bring it back when they return to the Bahamas. And then lastly, there's an opportunity for scientists, tour guides, fishermen, and so on to work together to create a sustainable industry that the best kinds of protocols and procedures. And this is just a quick example. Jody Pinder, who's one of the main fish tour guides, is a friend of ours. We went out and caught a couple of turtles and measured them and tagged them and everything. And we were just about to release the turtles, and I saw Jody and I called him over and I said, well, here, why don't you take this turtle and you can show it to your guests and then release it. And he was very happy. So it meant it was a turtle that he didn't chase himself, and he was able to show him and pass it over. And these guides have been very helpful to us in terms of anecdotal information about sea turtle populations and so on. Now, questions and concerns, and these are really quite serious. And a lot of these are relative and are going to require some judgment. Obviously, sea turtles and interacting with them is going to disrupt the natural feeding and behavior of the turtles. There's no question. The question is how much. And that's going to depend on how much they get fed, what they get fed, how long they're fed, how many days during the year. Are there extended periods where they're not being fed, where they might return to a more natural kind of behavior, and so on. We're concerned that the high protein diet that is fed the turtles during these operations, particularly the squid, will increase growth rates. And tag returns that we have from Exuma and Little Farmer's Key, turtles that we've tagged and recaptured, have demonstrated that these turtles are in fact growing faster. It may be altering their body chemistry. It may be affecting the microorganisms in their guts. I think that some of this is minimal, although we have to work, which I'll talk about, we have to prove that. But when we were watching the turtles being fed in Bottom Harbor, I got in the water and snorkeled for several hours. And you'd see the turtle come up and take a piece of squid, and then he'd kind of wander off, and I'd follow him around, and he'd go off a little bit, go down to the bottom, munch on some grass, go off a little further, maybe come down, munch on some grass, then maybe go over to another boat, take a piece of squid, and then go back, go down to the bottom and eat grass. So they're certainly not dependent upon the squid. And obviously there are bad days when the weather's bad and the tour guides don't come. So it's hard to tell how much this is affecting or disrupting their feeding behavior. Increased injury to turtles and tourists is a concern. Handling the turtles is obviously not a good idea. The turtles occasionally might get nipped, but if they're careful, they're all right. Just to follow up on what Emma was saying, some of the tour guides discovered that when they were handling the turtles, in some cases even throwing them back in the water, they would get pushback on social media. And one tour guide that we know quite well put photographs early on of his chasing turtles, and bringing him into the boat. And he got so much pushback from public media that not only did he stop posting those incidents, but he also stopped doing it. So I think this public media works, can work to everybody's advantage in some cases. There's also the potential for spread of disease. Green sea turtles have a virus that they can contract, fibropapillomatosis it's called, that causes benign tumors to grow. And it's a very serious concern. It's epidemic in the Bahamas. It's increasing in some of the habitats in Western Long Island and in Eleuthera. We haven't seen any of the disease near the feeding stations in Eleuthera or in Exumas, but it is prevalent in Long Island. And there is the possibility that if these turtles aggregate in greater numbers and in closer proximity to each other than they normally are, this might promote the spread of the disease. So in October, if we're all able to operate again in the Bahamas, we plan to start working with Department of Marine Resources and Atlantis that has a permanent veterinary on staff, and Annabelle Brooks, who's studying fibropapillomas in the Bahamas. We want to work with all of them to study the turtle biology and the potential spread for disease. So in conclusion, turtle tourism is growing. There's a hiatus period right now, which I hope will get better. Turtle tourism is growing, and it really offers significant economic, educational, and research opportunities if managed properly. And as part of what we want to do in October, we also want to run some workshops with the Spanish Wells tour guides and focus on turtles. But as Emma was suggesting, and I think it's important, we want to talk about marine mammals, pigs, starfish, all kinds of wildlife, and how to establish, safe practices and behavior. There's an increased value in live turtles that the local people see, and we're hoping that this plus the income for the guides will reduce the illegal harvest of sea turtles. And we are fairly certain that new protocols and proper education will lower some speed limits. We think we can get the tour guides to feed the turtles less squid and perhaps alternate that with a more natural food like bundles of seagrass and prevent them really from handling the sea turtles. So thank you very much. And I think it's time for community questions here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that very informative talk, hitting on some very key factors, something that we realize and appreciate on a national level and definitely at BNT. It was good news when we see that additional enforcement officers were required. Obviously, at the end of the day, one thing we appreciate, even though we have all our efforts, there still must be a level of enforcement. Enforcement is key in terms of monitoring these areas. Education and awareness. One agency probably we could definitely get involved in this whole process as well. I like how you're working with several entities. Networking is definitely the key in terms of addressing these issues in terms of conservation. But one mechanism that we've been considering as well is looking at working with the port department of the boat licensing agency. So all the tour operators and the like would have to be licensed, their boats licensed and inspected to this agency. So one of the things, could I kindly ask if you're not speaking, if you can mute your mic, please? Thanks.
Oh, sorry. You.
All right, thank you. But definitely the education and awareness, like I say, definitely would include the port department as a licensing body. Basically, they can establish terms and conditions for their licenses and their operators as well. And you highlight the fact that basically, just like everybody, all the other presenters, definitely highlight the fact that these species are definitely worth more alive than they are dead. So definitely through awareness and setting of new protocol and policies and effective enforcement and continued networking, a lot can be done. What we want to do now is turn over the sessions to questions and answers. I want to definitely thank all the persons who sat through the presentation, and your support is greatly appreciated by the panelists and the Bahamas National Trust. We'll be providing further information after the question and answer period, trying to get through as many questions as possible. So without any further ado, I'll go to the questions. The first question from Ms. Nera. The feeding of wildlife has become a popular means by which tourists and tourism operators can facilitate close observation and interaction with wildlife in the wild. These practices are widespread and have a variety of impacts on the wildlife and on the tourists. Do you think this practice of feeding and interacting too close to the wildlife should be encouraged? Any?
This is Chuck. I'm happy to take a first pass at that answer. So I think, you know, this is also, it's a philosophical question. I think it really depends on an individual, on their feelings about people's interactions with wildlife. Personally, I would prefer if people stayed their distance and observed at a distance. However, I also understand that there are some potential benefits of these interactions with people, especially in today's day and age. If we can garner more appreciation for wildlife that could potentially lead to conservation, I think that's a potential good thing. I think we just need to strike the right balance between what is right for the animal and what is right for the people and their livelihoods. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to provide information that can then be used to help with these types of decisions. But at the end of the day, it requires many different stakeholders to come together and have this conversation so that everyone's input is heard, but then there's a greater buy-in for whatever decision is eventually made.
Okay, thank you. Giselle, would you like to add anything to that?
Hi. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think Chuck's answer was pretty good. If one of the other panelists would like to put their input on that question, they can feel free to as well. But if not, we can move on to the next question.
Okay. Thank you very much. As there are a slew of questions. The next question, and this is actually to Dr. Reynolds. Is there a current estimate of how many people visit Conception Island annually?
Yes, thanks, Bonnie, for that question. We do not have very good information about current tourism to Conception Island. And that's one of the things that I've talked to the Bahamas National Trust about, is sort of how do we get a handle on who's going out there and what are they doing out there? And, you know, how can we make that something that's a little more controlled? You know, again, as a researcher, I go out there, you know, perhaps more regularly than many. And really it's my job just to collect the data. And of course, the National Trust is going to be in charge of deciding how to manage tourism in Conception Island. But what I do is I report what I see when I'm out there, and you know, try to help come up with ideas about understanding how people are using Conception Island. And this sort of gets to another point, which is that you know, we'd like for people to be able to visit, you know, the national parks. It's an important thing. And so trying to develop local capacity, especially on Long Island, with some of the tour operators who take dive groups out there to sort of get more involved in you know, paying attention to the island and thinking more about developing those opportunities for people to visit Conception.
Okay, thank you very much. It's appreciated. The next question comes from Morgan Haichu, and it's addressed to all of the speakers. And it's, what steps been taken by the Bahamian government what steps is the Bahamas government taking or should be taken to regulate human interaction with wild animals, specifically where the interaction may have a negative positive impact to the animals and human? Is regulation of these activities the responsibility of the tour operator or a Bahamian regulatory agency? Can you take us?
Well, this is Chuck. As a non-national, I'm always hesitant to be too strong in terms of recommendations, because what we do is supply the information and assist whenever possible. But I do think some type of, I know that in the chat, someone mentioned a certification program. I think that's a good idea. And I'm very excited about Emma's research, because if we can use that to demonstrate to tour operators that they perhaps don't have to do some of these activities that they think they have to do, I think that's a great starting point for having this conversation. And so what we're trying to do, really, this is an opportunity with the pandemic and with how the cessation of tourism countrywide, and presumably the stoppage of feeding. This is an opportunity now to go out and see what is happening to those animals now that these practices have stopped. And so currently we have permits pending to be able to do that. But then we can use that information to say, look, if we feed less, or if we feed this certain amount of food, or if we use this type of delivery system, it's better for the animals and better for a sustainable livelihood. So I would support some type of certification program. I think I would also support trying to find some external funding to do something along those lines. So I think that you find that most people that do research in the Bahamas are standing by and are ready to assist with these types of efforts.
I would also add, thank you for that. I would also add, basically, there is a National Maritime Policy Implementation Committee, and they're looking at various steps in which the BNT and the brief forms a part of this committee. And one of the subcommittees is an environmental subcommittee. So issues like this could be addressed in terms of looking for ways definitely to promote sustainable development. So I would say there are steps in terms of looking at ways to address various issues in terms of making it more sustainable to interact with the environment as such. But thank you for that. The next questions come from Donald Duncombe, and basically is, what is your view on introduction of non-endangered animals as tourist tours, like the regular pigs being used on Freeport, Grand Bahamas? And that question is open.
This is Chuck again. I thought Emma did a really nice job in her presentation about speaking that sometimes these types of activities, even if the animals are non-native, might then provide an incentive or some type of message for just wildlife in general. So some people may not understand that this is a non-native animal, or that it's okay to do with one animal but not another. So I think we just have to be careful. Obviously, from a conservation biologist, to me, I would prefer, if it has to happen, that it happens with a non-native animal. But if there could be some knockoff effects of that we have to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the information. Next question from there: how do we ascertain the right balance between economic development and environmental preservation as far as wildlife tourism is concerned? Irresponsible tourism under the guise of local economic development can result in long-term impact environmentally and ecologically to the sustainability and existence of these wildlife. So they want to strike, how do we ascertain the balance between economic development and environmental preservation?
This is Graham Reynolds. Obviously, one of the goals is going to be, this development of ecotourism, right? Responsible development of enjoyment of natural resources. I think it could be different for some of these different areas that have been discussed in this series of presentations. From my perspective, from Conception Island, that is a very sensitive area. And so responsible tourism might look a little different out there than it would elsewhere in terms of the potential impact. So, I think there's certainly opportunities to grow both environmental appreciation sustainably as well as economic development. But it can be perhaps different in different contexts.
Yeah, and I want to mirror what Graham just mentioned. I think it is region specific. I know I did some work on Andros a number of years ago with the iguana, but through the course of that research, I also did surveys of tourists that were coming to that island and found that, as you can imagine, people that are coming to Andros are typically more environmentally aware, and that they were willing to pay to go on specific tours. They were willing to pay for fees to go into national parks. So I do think that you can tailor it based on the region within the country.
Can I add to that too? This is Emma. In the first presentation on iguanas, I noticed there was an image from a study that was done in Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park a number of years ago, and it was to build a sustainable tourism model. And it was based on community consultation and based on consultation with the park managers or all the relevant government and local stakeholders and community members. And it was really a process of collaboratively considering how do we define sustainable tourism? What are the economic benefits that we're looking for? What are the social benefits? What are the environmental concerns to take into account? What are the, what's needed to keep tourism healthy as well? They're like these 4 dimensions. And through a process of many meetings, there were different kind of targets, different indicators and different targets identified. And that approach to sustainable tourism modeling is something that's done in some parts of the world and that's seen as perhaps an update and perhaps more easily able to be implemented, not as sometimes harsh as a full regulatory approach that that can help to guide and shape tourism, say more than say carrying capacity. So that might be an interesting approach to consider, the sustainable tourism model.
Thank you for that, Emma. Very appreciate that information. Definitely very informative stuff coming from you today. Appreciate that, as well as all our panelists. This one is for Stephen. Is there any data on the motivations for why some folks continue to eat turtles, which may provide some insight, additional strategies to help shift their consumption?
Yeah, I think the motivation is fairly simple. Bahamians have been eating sea turtles for centuries, and especially in places, the Abacos and Spanish Wells and some other places, it's also part of their tradition. I can remember one of the wealthier businessmen in Nassau coming up to Spanish Wells always on his birthday and ordering a turtle to be captured for him and served for his birthday. Spanish Wellsmen continue to take turtles illegally. I think the number they take illegally is diminishing, but it's still fairly common. They eat it, they love it, it's delicious. So it's pretty simple.
Thank you very much for that answer. I appreciate that. Are there any further questions? I don't see any further questions appearing in the panelists. I just would like to, if not, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists who have provided very, very insightful information today. Our whole panelists it included Dr. Charles Knapp, Dr. Susannah French, Dr. Charles Witt, Dr. Graham Reynolds, Ms. Emma Doyle, Mr. Stephen Cornett. Definitely appreciate your contribution, and have basically highlighted a lot of things that we can do. And we would like definitely to continue dialogue along those streamlines. We like to thank all persons who have participated today and who have basically supported the BNT and this Natural History Conference as well. And we'd be grateful if you would consider donating towards the success of the BHNC in 2020. Hope that you're definitely enjoying the series. We simply ask that you consider giving a donation. No amount is too small. Show your support. You can look at the email on the screen, direct onto our social media at BHNC to follow on social media updates. Questions and suggestions can be directed directly to BNHC at BNTBS. Again, we appreciate everybody's participation and support of this event, and definitely would not be possible without our partners who provide invaluable information. And we just hope that the information has been absorbed and that we would build on the information that we received today and continue to protect our natural environment and the species associated therein. So we basically could produce a more sustainable economy with regard to protection of the environment and all species alike. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Bahamas National Trust.
Thank you, Giselle.